They say death comes quietly, slipping in like a shadow, soft as a final breath. But you see, the Greeks knew better, because not all deaths are gentle. Some are violent, some are filled with blood and terror, with screams that go unanswered. And those deaths, they belonged to someone else. They called them the dark spirits of battlefields, of murder, of fate twisted by violence. They weren't angels, nor demons, nor gods. They were hunger made flesh. And when they came for you, there was no mercy, no peace, just a terrifying tearing of a soul from body. A certainty that your death would not be the end. The Greeks feared them. Warriors whispered their names. But here's the question. Were they just myths? Or did they see something that we've forgotten? And if they were real, where are they now? Welcome Lorekeepers to the Lorekeepers Library. My name's Kaylee and I am taking you through some Greek history this evening. We're going into the world of the Keres. If you like what we do and you love anything to do with lore, mythology and legend, then why not consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Now let's get comfy and explore the battlefields. In the ancient world, battlefields were more than places of strategy and steel. They were sacred, haunted spaces where life and death collided. The Greeks believed that when blood touched the earth, something was awakened, something dark. The battlefield weren't just where men died, it was where the Keres fed. These were no ordinary spirits. They didn't wait in the underworld like Hades. They didn't escort souls like Hermes. No, the Keres were the creatures of the moment, of chaos, frenzy, and the exact second a soul slipped loose with a scream. They hovered above carnage like vultures, only they weren't interested in flesh, they wanted the soul. Descriptions of the Keres vary, but most accounts paint a picture of a winged, shadowed being with claws for hands and eyes that burnt red. Mouths smeared with blood of the dying. They weren't quiet observers, they fought each other over the choicest souls. Those who died in fear, in agony without glory. Because of the Keres, death was a feast. Homer writes of them in the Iliad, where they hover near Achilles, desperate to claim him, but they're not the only supernatural force on the battlefield. Athena and Ares are there too. Even the gods themselves had to guard the fates of heroes from the ravenous spirits, known as the Keres. That tells us something. Even immortals couldn't always stop what the Keres had begun. And their presence wasn't just mythic, it was ritual. Before battles, Greek warriors would offer sacrifices and prayers, not just for strength, but to keep the Keres at bay. They feared being forgotten, dying unavenged, their bodies unburned, and rightly so. Because to die like that was to fall prey to the Keres, completely, soul and all. The Greeks didn't romanticize war, they saw it for what it was, a calling ground for darker things. And the Keres were proof that sometimes the most terrifying part of dying wasn't the pain. To understand the Keres, we need to go back, far beyond Olympus, past the stories of Zeus and Hera, past the wars of God and men. We need to step into the primordial dark, because that's where they come from. You see, the Keres were daughters of Nyx, the goddess of night. Not the night sky, not twilight, but the essence of night itself. The kind of night that settles over the soul, the kind that suffocates, devours and consumes. And Nyx didn't birth joy or light. Her children were fear, death, doom, strife and deception. You see, Keres weren't her only deadly daughters as such. Among their siblings were Thanatos, known for a peaceful death, Hypnos, for sleep, Keres, god of strife, the Moirai, the fates who cut the thread of life, and Apathy, the spirit of deceit. And yet the Keres stood out, because they weren't abstract. They didn't represent death as a concept. They enacted it, with blood and teeth and claws. Some ancient scholars believed that Keres had her own domain, not one spirit, but many, each linked to a specific kind of violent end, one for war, one for murder, one for sudden accidents, perhaps even one for suicide or sacrifice, as they weren't passive forces. They actively sought out dying, driven by an endless, insatiable hunger. Others describe them to be a swarm, too many to count, descending like crows over a battlefield, murderous spirits in the truest sense. Not one death, but death multiplied. And it's telling that, even in the vast and wild world of Greek mythology, the Keres had no temples, no priests, no prayers. Because you didn't worship the Keres, you feared them, you avoided them, and if you saw them, it was already too late. When we speak of the Keres, we often isolate them, see them as only battlefield scavengers, but the truth is more tangled because the Keres weren't alone. They were part of a darker pantheon, a family of primordial forces that govern the edges of life, death and fate. And when you start tracing those threads, a strange pattern begins to form. As we said, Nyx, their mother, Night herself, in Hesiod's Theogony, Nyx doesn't need a consort. She creates alone, giving birth to some of the most fearsome creatures in Greek myth. And her offspring embody unavoidable truths. The Keres, they don't work from a distance. Not like the others. They don't cut threads or nudge destinies. They pounce, they attack. They're death with teeth. And yet they complement the others. While the fates decide when a person dies, the Keres decides how brutally. If Thanatos is a closed door, the Keres are the storm that throws you through it. Some later sources confuse them with harpies or furies or other fearsome female spirits. But make no mistake, the Keres are something entirely of their own. They don't punish, they don't avenge, they simply arrive and take. And there's something else, something that hints at just how ancient they are. Because in earlier pre-Olympian beliefs, death wasn't a god, it was a spirit, a force, a shadow in the corner of the eye. And in that worldview, the Keres weren't just that myth. They were the inevitable end that no name could soften. In the realm of Greek myth, death wears many faces. Some gentle, some are cruel, and some are utterly indifferent. But the two names that often appear side by side in these stories are Thanatos and the Keres. Both walk hand in hand with mortality. Both their roles, their methods and their legacies, they could not be more different. You see, Thanatos is often misunderstood. In the Iliad, he appears not as a monster but as a calm, winged figure, a deliverer. He carries the souls of the dead to the afterlife with quiet reverence. He's neither cruel nor kind, just necessary, a divine constant. He comes for kings and slaves alike, no pain, no fear, just the end. But the Keres, they don't deliver your soul, they just devour it. Where Thanatos waits for an appointed time, the Keres hunt. They swarm over battlefields seeking those who are still clinging to life, and they rip, they wrench and they drink. Their robes are soaked in blood, their fingers end in claws, their faces are distorted with hunger. Some texts describe warriors trying to fight them off with their last breath, struggling not just against death but against the manner of their dying. Because a death claimed by Thanatos was peace, and a death claimed by Keres was the torment. Interestingly, Thanatos was not universally feared in mythology. He appears in stories with Heracles and Sisyphus. In modern tales, death is often invisible. It's an idea more than a presence. But to the ancient Greeks, death could have had a face, a form, or a figure that stood before you in your final moments. And when that death was violent, when it was drawn out and soaked in agony, as we've seen, it wasn't Thanatos who arrived. The Greeks didn't just believe in these spirits abstractly, they claimed to see them. And what's more unsettling, past these ancient scriptures, is that they competed for souls, fighting, shrieking and snarling at one another for the most tragic, most brutal deaths. But why? The ancients believed that the Keres were especially drawn to unburied corpses, the souls of wandered, deaths without honour, which left the spirit vulnerable, and places of mass bloodshed, where grief and violence lingered in the air like incense. And some believed you could feel them before you saw them. A chill or a weight on the chest, a pressure behind the eyes, and then a flash of wings. And the worst part was, when you saw a Keres, there was no turning back. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a dream, it was a promise. And even their name, Keres, carried layered meanings of doom, fate and a violent end. But unlike the Fates, who wove fate from birth, the Keres only came when your thread was fraying and slick with blood. They weren't mourners, they didn't linger, they just fed and vanished. In the age before cinema, before photography, myth lived in stone and pigment. And though the Keres may not have had temples or priests, they definitely have left their mark, not in worship, but in a warning throughout history. You see, they appear on ancient vases scratched into black figure pottery, painted in red or ochre. But these weren't comforting images, no flowing robes or gentle faces for these. The Keres are always shown with wings outstretched, their teeth bared, their hands clawed, and dripping in menace. One of the most famous depictions, where the hero Heracles is shown fighting a Keres. Not a metaphor, literally wrestling death incarnate. Heracles in his labours was often shown battling creatures that blurred the line between monster and spirit. But here he's not just fighting a beast, he's wrestling a violent fate itself. Art historians interpret these images in many ways. Some people believe the Keres represent what people feared the most. Not just dying, but dying in pain, in chaos, and forgotten. Others see them as a symbolic embodiment of plague, war, and the mindless cruelty of nature. And here's something fascinating. Their portrayal changes depending on the era. In early depictions, the Keres are animalistic, wild, almost insect-like. But in later art, they become more women-shaped, echoing the terrifying beauty of the Furies or even Medusa. It's as though the more the Greeks feared them, the more human they became. And isn't that a little chilling? The death, when we fear it most, takes on our own face. Some later playwrights blurred the Keres with other spirits, using them as stand-ins for inevitable ruin. In tragedy, if a character spoke of seeing a shadow or a dark winged figure in a dream, it wasn't symbolic, it was a visitation, a silent spectral claim. And still the Keres never speak in these stories. They don't plead, they don't tempt, they appear, and the end follows. In the ancient world, nearly every god or spirit had a place, a temple, an altar, or a festival. Offerings were made, sacrifices were given. Even the most fearsome deities like Hades could be appeased. But it doesn't seem to be the case for the Keres. There were no temples for them, no hymns, no festivals in their honour. Their names were not written in votive plaques or called out in prayer. In fact, to speak their names aloud was to tempt them, to acknowledge them, to invite them if they were near. Because the Keres weren't worshipped, they were avoided. And yet they were everywhere, not just in stories but in rituals of protection, especially in times of war or plague when death walked freely among the living. Take the Anasteria, for example. It was a 3-day festival honouring Dionysus and the dead. On the final day, doors were smeared with pitch and people chewed buckthorn, not for wine or celebration, but to ward off wandering spirits, Keres included. Children in Athens were sometimes given protective amulets, tiny tokens to deflect evil. These were not just for show, they were crafted and blessed to keep the dark spirits from claiming young lives too soon. And during wartime, warriors weren't only afraid of the enemy, they were feared for what would find them after the final blow. Before battle, soldiers would whisper charms or wear iron talismans, believing that the cold bite of metal could turn away the black-winged sisters who hovered overhead. Even in funerary practices, the influence of the Keres lingered. It was believed that if a body was left unburied or not buried properly, the soul became restless and more vulnerable to the Keres, who would feed not on blood, but on the torment of a spirit caught between the worlds. So instead of worship, the Keres received avoidance, ritual silence and defensive magic. To give them offerings was to admit to their presence, and the Greeks believed that some beings should not be invited in. But they weren't gods of balance or justice, they were raw hunger circling in the dark, and the only way to survive them was not to be seen. If we walk through the streets of our modern world, the Keres seem far behind us, hidden among the stories of old, fading into myths. And yet, are they? Are they truly gone? Or have they just adapted, slipping quietly through the cracks of our understanding? In the shadows of every battlefield, in the quiet places where grief lingers, are they not still present? Maybe not with wings or talons, but that creeping feeling at the back of your mind, when the darkness presses too tightly and the world feels too silent. In modern warfare, when the terror of violence permeates the air, can we still hear them? Those whispers, the whispers of impending doom, those thoughts that tell us we don't make it out alive. And in our own personal struggles too, whether it's illness, loss or the sense of uncontrollable fate, there are times when it feels as though the Keres are near, standing just out of sight, watching. Perhaps we no longer see them as winged, blood-soaked figures of ancient art, but don't they linger in those moments when death and sorrow become tangible? When the inevitable approaches and the veil between the living and the dead grows thin. Consider how we speak of accidents, the sudden, random events that changed the lives in an instant, that freak accident, as if death has no rhyme or reason. The Keres knew better. They never needed a reason. They just took. They always took. And are they still taking? It's fascinating, isn't it, that some ancient fears haven't faded, but have instead woven their way into our modern lives, transformed perhaps, but still haunting the edges of our awareness. The Keres may not fly over our battlefields, but don't we still fear them? In every brush with death and every moment with the darkness, it feels just a bit too close. So as we sit in the soft glow of our modern world, I urge you to pause to think. Are the Keres really gone? Or are they simply waiting? Our modern world, their new arena. Ever present in the quiet corners of our fears, the darkness that we still don't understand. The Keres, as ancient as they are, still linger, still haunt, and still hunt. And I think they always will. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's podcast. I hope you've enjoyed the world of the Keres. If you like what we do, then please hit that like button. And if you have a subject that you'd like us to cover, then why not let us know in the comments? We love hearing from all of you. Until next week, when Chris will be back with a new exploration into the world of mythology. As always, continue to explore the world with wonder.